Sawadee Krap. Welcome to Thai Move Talk and another episode of Connections. I am your host, Brian Berletic. Let's talk about all of these children books that are turning up in the middle of these US-backed protests here in Asia. A couple of months ago, there was this case in Hong Kong that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But first, I want to show you these books that turned up here in Thailand recently. And as you can see, they're not very subtle. I mean, they're just literally just cartoon versions of the actual protests, the protest symbols and gestures and flags that they're carrying. If we scroll up here, there's more flags and Democracy Monument, and there's cartoon versions of these protest leaders. And this is an op-ed in an English language newspaper here in Thailand, and it's titled "Kids' Books Offer Hope Against Tyranny." And the author just makes this bold statement that Thailand is a tyranny and a dictatorship. They never qualify it. They never talk about the fact that there was a general election in 2019 and the opposition out protesting right now lost. US-backed billionaire Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit and his Future Forward Party lost by over 2 million votes. The other US-backed billionaire Thaksin Shinawatra, who's a convicted criminal and a fugitive hiding overseas to evade justice, his Pheu Thai party lost by over 500,000 votes. And so this is a supposed pro-democracy movement that rejected the outcome of the election because it didn't suit them. And then Thanathorn's party, Future Forward, because he donated over 100 million Thai baht to it in direct, blatant violation of Thailand's election laws, was dissolved because that's the stipulated punishment for doing that. And so in the beginning, he was actually the one leading these protests, and then he hid behind them. And he got these so-called student youth leaders to run it for him. And his party has been hiding behind them ever since. And these protests have been out in the streets ever since, carrying out violence, and now on a daily basis. And I'm talking about assault, the use of weapons, arson, damaging private and public property. And just last month, one of these protesters threw one of their homemade explosives at a police officer and blew half of his face off and put him in a coma. So that's what's going on. And now we've got someone making kids' books about all of this. And by the way, these protest leaders, if you actually listen to them, they say things that you could not say on national TV. It would have to be censored. Even the English equivalent in the US, you would not be allowed to say that on TV. And definitely you wouldn't be allowed to get in front of a group of children and say these things. So extremely inappropriate, indefensible, and yet we have an op-ed here trying to defend it. Now, there is a reason why you have to be a certain age to vote, because people who are too young, they don't understand the system, they cannot make an informed decision, and kids who are young enough don't even understand what you're talking about, even if you're presenting it in a balanced way. But as you can see, these books are not balanced at all. It's just opposition propaganda, promoting the symbols, the gestures, to kind of induct them into the movement. Why are they doing that? Because if you look out in the streets, they'll be lucky if they could get a couple of hundred people together in Bangkok, a city of 12 to 14 million people. They're extremely unpopular. They lost the election at the height of their popularity, and they've only gotten more unpopular since. And so how are they replenishing the ranks? They're preying on people who are too young to see through their lies, to see through the emptiness of their movement, the deception of claiming to be pro-democracy, but rejecting election results, claiming to stand for the rule of law, but when the court rules against them, they reject the ruling. And worst of all is the foreign funding, because as I've pointed out many times before, and you could just go to the US National Endowment for Democracy's official website, Thailand 2020, and you can see the names of all of the core organizations supporting, promoting, and leading the protests. You can see them listed here with money amounts in US dollars that they receive from the US government every single year. They're the ones running these protests. So again, democracy, it's a process of self-determination. Everything about this opposition here in Thailand is determined and dependent on Washington. Take Internet Law Reform Dialogue, also known as iLaw. If you go to their official website and you scroll down, I mean, even they admit that they're funded by the US government. All of this money, if they weren't getting this from foreign interests, they would not be able to operate. And what are they doing in Thailand as part of the protests? They're doing things like this. They're launching a petition to rewrite Thailand's entire constitution. This is what they were doing. So this was one of the three key demands of the protests. US government-funded iLaw was the one organizing the petition. They were at every single protest collecting signatures for this petition. They also promote the protests on a daily basis with their large social media presence. There's also Thai Lawyers for Human Rights. They're also funded by the US government, and they wouldn't exist without that funding. One of their lawyers, Anand Nampa, is one of the core leaders leading these protests after Thanaton started hiding behind them. Thai Lawyers for Human Rights also provides free legal service to give the protesters and agitators a sense of impunity so they can maximize the level of chaos. That's why the US government is funding this. It's not obviously to promote democracy, because if you're a foreign government reaching into another country's political system, that is interference. It's the opposite of promoting democracy. I think everyone can agree that that's quite troubling, that a violent mob led by billionaires and backed by foreign interests, they're now trying to indoctrinate children. I could already hear some of the grumpy old malcontent expats complaining and saying, Brian, doesn't the Thai education system indoctrinate Thai children into things like understanding and learning about the monarchy? If you can't tell the difference between a 700-year-old plus institution that is part of Thai culture and history and a foreign-funded opposition burning things down in the streets on a daily basis, if you can't tell the difference between that, I don't know what else to tell you. Now, I said I was going to talk about the mob in Hong Kong and how they were publishing children's books. First, I want to kind of explain what the connection is. I mean, I think we all remember hearing about the Milk Tea Alliance. This is a BBC article. Twitter creates emoji for pro-democracy activists. And I've gone over many times how US-based social media platforms like Twitter work with the US State Department to help advance US foreign policy. And that includes helping promote these US-backed opposition groups. And in Asia, they have a couple of them. And they try to string them together into this Milk Tea Alliance. And it even says right here in the BBC article, the alliance has brought together anti-Beijing protesters in Hong Kong and Taiwan with pro-democracy campaigners in Thailand and Myanmar. And if you look at these Thai and Myanmar protests, you will see they're also extremely anti-China, because that's what it's all about. The governments in this region are not interested in America's crusade against China, so the US is creating political groups that are interested in it and will overthrow the governments in the region, worm their way into power, cut their nation's ties with China, and leave the country isolated. This is what this is all about. It has nothing to do with democracy, and it doesn't even have anything to do with the best interests of any of these countries, because when they cut ties off with China, they're going to suffer also. And if you want an example of what this looks like, just look at what Australia is doing to themselves right now. And I think we all remember Thanaton going to Hong Kong and posing for pictures with Joshua Wong, the US-backed agitator there in Hong Kong, and Penguin also going to Hong Kong and posing in pictures with Joshua Wong and Nathan Law. And that's when Penguin wasn't hanging out at the US Embassy here in Bangkok, and when Joshua Wong wasn't hanging out in Washington, D.C. And Thanaton getting involved with Joshua Wong actually prompted the Chinese embassy in Thailand to condemn it, to lodge a formal complaint about it, because at the time, Thanaton was a sitting member of Thai parliament. And so we see Hong Kong faced the same problem. They had a group, part of this Milk Tea Alliance. How did Hong Kong deal with it? First of all, they passed the national security law and they put the protests to an end immediately. And they started rounding up all of these politicians that were involved with foreign interests. And so they are out of the government. And when someone in Hong Kong tried to publish children books, just like the ones we saw here in Thailand, they got arrested. And they might go to jail for doing that. And those books were seized. And no kid is ever going to touch those books, and nor should they. This is from Reuters. Children's tales of sheep and wolves incite sedition, Hong Kong police say. This is from 3 months ago. And that's what happened. They arrested them, They seized the books. There they are. You can see they're a little more subtle than the Thai ones, but it's still obvious what they were doing there. So Hong Kong passed a national security law and it makes it very easy for them to root out all forms of sedition, even when it's camouflaged as a benign children's book. Thailand does not have a national security law, and it might not be practical for Thailand to have one. China can stand up to the foreign backers of the opposition groups there. Thailand really can't. But there are other things they can do indirectly to deal with this and kind of get the same result as an official national security law. If you are a parent of Thai children like I am, get active in their education. Make sure they're not being exposed to something like this. And if they are, speak up about it. This opposition claims to stand for democracy, while we all know that that's not true. If more people come out against this than for it and they make their voices heard, even if they can't do it through the government, it'll just expose them as hypocrites once again. It'll further undermine the illusion of legitimacy that they're always so desperate to create. That does it for this week's episode of Connections for Thai Move Talk. I will see you again next week. Sawadee Krap.